I need you to ignore for a second that everything you're hearing doesn't match what you're seeing. I had some unfortunate equipment failures on this trip, but I'm going to try to make up for that as best I can. This was May 13th. I was at Rosaryville State Park in Rosaryville, Maryland. And this was a late afternoon after being up at work in Northern Virginia. A place I'd driven by on 301 all the time, but never bothered to stop, and was pleasantly surprised to find that in about 5 minutes out of the parking lot I was in a remote world of big trees and a lot of greenery. It was very nice. I had spent all afternoon on another trip testing a new microphone for my camera, and it worked great. But I found out the hard way that unfortunately, if it's not seated just right, the software inhibits even the native microphone, so I wind up getting nothing. So instead of just having to amplify the mic pickup in post, I got absolutely nothing to work with. So it's sad, because this was a really good trip and I would have loved to have captured the sounds of the birds and the wind and all of that kind of stuff, but this is what I'm dealing with. It was a gorgeous day. I tried to do this, probably mid-70s and crystal clear, very breezy. The wind was blowing, gusting up to 25 knots, but it was mostly up in the treetops, and I didn't feel it, but there was a nice background hiss to the whole evening with the wind blowing up through the tops of the trees. I have to admit, when I first saw this tree, I had no idea what it was, but I liked the flowers and the nuts were intriguing. This is a princess tree, or also called a royal paulownia, and it's an invasive species, actually. It's an ornamental tree that's native to China, extremely fast growing, and tends to choke everything else out in a fight for sunlight. And since I saw it here, I've seen it in several other places. The flowers are pretty distinctive. Not a lot, but obviously one of these that gets planted ornamentally and then sort of takes control. Pretty, though. Most of the forest that I was walking through was either tulip poplar or beech, but I had to take note of this beech tree. It was enormous, about 3 feet across, and a huge soaring canopy with the nearest branches 50 feet up. Just a gorgeous tree. You can often tell tulip poplar groves even at a distance because the trunks tend to be arrow straight all the way up. And when they grow in groups like this, it actually looks like the columns of a cathedral or a great hall.
I have no idea what this is, but it's a little creepy.
I had been eyeing these locust blooms for about a week or so. Glad I got to find one. This is a black locust tree, and you can tell it's a black locust because of the simple opposite compound leaves, where the leaflets are about the size of a thumbprint. And for only about a week and a half, this tree will bloom with these white cascading chandelier flowers, and the smell around a locust grove is it's outstanding. But they're very short-lived, and locusts tend to be one of the last trees to get their leaves and one of the first trees to lose them. So there's a good part of the year where locusts are appearing dead while everything else has got green on it, and they're often mistaken for dead as a result. They're not very attractive trees typically. They grow along the edges of clearings, kind of scrub forest. They don't show up in mature forest, and you can see this one's growing on the edge of a power line cut. The trunk is very deeply grooved and mottled and kind of has a withered look to it. And the branches have these evil-looking thorns on them as well, particularly out where the branches are thin. So there's not a lot to love about this tree, except that the wood is extremely dense. It's very resistant to rot, and so it's really popular for use in areas where you need to have wood against the ground, and it'll last a nice long time. And of course the flowers are edible, so I'm going to try some. And turns out the roots, the bark, the leaves, the seeds are all poisonous, but the flowers are supposedly really good. So the intent here was to collect some and take them home, because from all I've read, the best way to enjoy these flowers is to batter fry them into little fritters. So I'm going to give that a try.
Let me tell you a little bit about the history of Rosaryville. Rosaryville State Park encloses an old mansion that's now just used for events, but it was called Mount Airy Mansion, and it was built by Charles Calvert, the 3rd Lord of Baltimore, back in 1660 as a hunting lodge. At the time it was just a 50-foot span building with single fireplaces at either end. Well, it got passed down through the generations until ultimately the son of the 5th Lord Calvert, a guy by the name of Benedict Swingate Calvert, was the primary inhabitant of the expanded mansion that we know today and that still stands. Well, interestingly enough, the aristocracy of early America all got fairly intertwined back in those days, and in ways that I didn't really appreciate until I started to look into the history of this place. Benedict had a daughter named Eleanor Calvert. She went by Nellie, and Nellie Calvert got married in 1774 to a man named John Parke Custis. John Parke was the son of Martha Custis, who would later remarry and become Martha Washington. And the Calverts got connected to the Washingtons through this marriage. Nellie Calvert and John Parke Custis had a son named George Washington Parke Custis, named after his grandfather. George Washington Parke Custis would go on to build another famous house. This one was over in Arlington, Virginia, and he built this huge Greek Revival mansion on top of a hill overlooking the Potomac River and across to D.C. George Washington Parke Custis and his wife had a daughter named Mary Custis, who would marry a young officer by the name of Robert Edward Lee, and the house would eventually get passed down to him. So Robert E. Lee had become a hero in the Mexican War, and of course was a sitting general living in Arlington House, there in Arlington, when the Civil War broke out. Famously told General Winfield Scott that he could not raise his hand against Virginia, went to fight for the South, and the federal government selected the site of Arlington House as the place to build their new national cemetery, partly so that Robert E. Lee could never fully return home. Arlington Cemetery stands there today, and that house, Arlington House, is still the centerpiece of it. So it's just sort of interesting that spanning what amounts to a couple of centuries, from the house Mount Airy being built in 1660 all the way up through the Civil War, these prominent families were all connected. If I was on a horse, this would be real exciting. So I really don't know where I am. I took a turn back there, basically based on counting intersections. I think this is what's marked on the Rosaryville map as the inner loop. But it has no blazes that I can tell, just some surveyor's tape on the trees. So, we will see where this leads me. Hopefully I'm not on a wild goose chase and setting myself up for a lot of backtracking. Alright, so it's official. In terms of a specific sense, where am I? I'm lost. I know how to get back to where I need to be, but I don't know what path I'm on, really. This place tends to have quite a few sort of homemade trails that splinter off, and I don't know, the whole place is built kind of like it was meant to just be a mountain biking and horseback riding playground. The trails double back on themselves. There's switchbacks for no reason, just lots of hairpin turns and things. Really easy to lose orientation in here, and what I thought was a real trail in this marked inner loop trail is clearly not. I actually ran into a marker that showed little red arrows indicating an old red blaze trail that I don't see on the map at all, so I'm not sure what I'm on, but I'm headed back towards the general direction of the perimeter. Good thing about a perimeter, once you're inside it, you go any direction, you know you'll hit it eventually. So hopefully I haven't wandered too far off track. Obviously this trail isn't terribly ad hoc. Still a mountain bike playground though.
As I walked along, I'd noticed that I'd seen pieces of tulip poplar flower laying on the trail, and I finally found a spot where an entire branch had come down. Tulip poplars, typically the flowers bloom in the sunshine, so way up high in the tree, unless the tree happens to be on the edge of a clearing. The flowers will fall down in the breeze, but you can see here why they call it a tulip poplar. It looks very much like a tulip flower, a delicate yellow-white flower. And the leaves are very distinctive too. They almost look like a cat with big pointy ears and fluffy cheeks. The unopened buds, you can tell that the trees are just starting to bloom like this, and we ought to be seeing more flowers in the coming weeks. This is one of the biggest black knot fungus infections I'd ever seen. Overall impressions of Rosaryville were real positive. I really enjoyed the park. Really surprised at the size and maturity of the trees. It was an interesting park, though. I mean, it would walk around, or the path would follow around the edge of creek valleys that were fairly precipitous as they would fall down towards the creeks, and we'd try to stay at a constant elevation. It was an interesting, though, because the perimeter trail that I mostly walked on here was obviously built with mountain bikers in mind. And the plus side on that, there were very few very steep hills. On the minus, it would shift directions and wind around aimlessly, almost completely without reason. I mean, you would just do S-turns and random chicanes, and it was just odd to hike that. But I can see where it would have been fun on a mountain bike. And some of the turns were even banked, so I mean, you could tell it was just built with that in mind. The other interesting thing was that, well, because of that, and you saw in the middle where I got lost a little bit, is that there were several ad hoc trails that branched off of that. Some of the bikers would start to learn, I think, where the switchbacks were and start to cut across it. And, you know, that causes erosion problems, but also just sort of takes away a little bit from the beauty of the woods, because, you know, there's a patchwork of trails through there. A lot of the park is actually open meadow, but never really break out, except towards the end of my hike, where I did break out on the edge of the meadows a couple of times, and of course crossing the power line. And those were nice too, just getting some open areas. So all in all, it was good. Just have to watch out for bikers. I did encounter a few. There were even some signs you might have seen here that, you know, to warn bikers to slow down because of blind turns. It's definitely got a mountain bike vibe. But good trail. I'm glad I did it, and probably find an excuse to come out here again. To cook up these flowers, I did bring them home, and so I got David and Douglas to help me out. So what we did was we basically took the flowers and put them in a pot, and then we washed the flowers a little bit, but then used the residual moisture to batter them a little bit, just coat them in a little bit of cornmeal and with some salt and pepper added. So with that done, we heated some oil over a stove and just dropped the battered flowers in and cooked them up in hot oil until they were nice and brown. Everybody was eager to try these. We gave Douglas his own plate because he'd been sick the past couple of days, but for the rest of us, we just spooned them out and each grabbed a fork. They were good. They were nice and light. The flavor of them, I can tell, would be heavily dependent on how you breaded them and how heavily. But we did a fairly light coat, and so I think the flavor of the flour came through. The cornmeal was a little gritty. It might have been nicer to do with a little bit of extra wheat flour in there as well. But all in all, a nice treat. We'll have to do this again.